Morning. My name's Steve Sherrill, and I'm the pastor here at Palos Community Church. I'm really glad that all of you have joined us today. If today happens to be one of your first times here, if maybe this is your first time here, I want to say a special welcome to you. You selected a great week to come and check us out because we are currently in a series called Own the Vision, and we're in week 2 of Own the Vision. And what this is about is that for quite a bit of this last year, our ministry staff and our leadership here at the church has really been praying and discerning and seeking out God's unique call for us as a church. We've spent a lot of time discussing what our mission, vision, and values are. And I believe really strongly that if as a church, if we want to actually get somewhere, if we want to accomplish something for the Lord, then we actually need to have a plan. And so if you're new here today, this will give you a glimpse into the way that we believe God is leading us at Palos Community Church and who we are striving to be. Because God does have a specific plan for us. And we're going to do everything we can as individuals, and then together as a church, we're going to do everything we can to follow God's will for his people and his church. We started this series last Sunday, and we talked about one of our 4 core values, and that value that we talked about last week is that we give generously. Now this week, we're going to talk about a value of ours that is we serve selflessly. You see, I think we live in an interesting time. Interesting may not be the word that all of us would choose, but I'm going to just use interesting for the sake of this conversation today. We live in an interesting time where our world seems to be becoming more and more self-focused. We might even start using a word like self-centered, or just be really blunt and say selfish. And there's 2 ways of thinking that I feel are becoming shockingly prevalent in our world today. And because of these 2 ways of thinking that are becoming so common, I believe that we as a church, we as Christians, can actually have an amazing opportunity to make an unforgettable impact in the lives of others. This first thing that I think I'm starting to see more and more and more, the first way that people are beginning to view the world is this: everything you have is mine, and I'm going to do whatever I need to do to get it. See, the idea of having a moral compass doesn't exist for so many people in our world today. They actually feel justified in taking what they want simply because they want it. And next, I believe that there's another view, there's another line of thinking that is sort of in response to the one that I just shared, which is a statement that says something like this: everything I have is mine, and I'll do everything I can to keep it. See, as Christians, we have an opportunity to impact our world today by having an attitude quite different from either one of those. We can impact our world by having an attitude that says, you know what, everything I have is yours, and I'm willing to give to you to help meet your need. I'm sure some of you had some heart palpitations or felt a little stress with that statement, right? Everything I have is yours, and I'm willing to do what I can to help meet your need. Maybe there was a twinge of fear or thinking to yourself, man, I can't believe that's really what Steve said. Is that what we as Christians should think, that everything I have is yours, and I'm willing to give of what I have to help meet your need? Now, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I am saying that if we want to be a community who serves selflessly, then isn't that how we should approach things? Shouldn't we be thinking everything I have is yours, and I'll give from what I have to help meet your need? It's kind of the mi casa, su casa that we hear thrown around in our culture today. And so this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to use this story of the Good Samaritan, a very familiar story from Scripture. Most of you are probably very familiar with it, and we're going to use this to discuss the 5 principles that we will experience if we want to serve in a way that's pleasing to God. And so the story starts with a man who's described in Scripture as being an expert in the law. And he asked Jesus a question. But the passage tells us this morning that it wasn't just that he was asking him a question. It says that he was testing Jesus. See, this man knew the law very well. He knew that the Bible commanded him to love God and love his neighbor. But he was trying to suggest that the definition of neighbor was rather narrow. He's trying to suggest that the definition of neighbor is much more narrow than we might think, and that it only includes others who are like him. And so in response, Jesus tells this story. And he tells this story to illustrate the importance of serving others, even others who might be quite different from us. And so the first thing that we learn, the first principle that we're going to get from this passage about serving selflessly is that we need to have a consciousness. Okay? We need to have a consciousness. That's principle number one. What we need to do is to develop an awareness of the needs of those around us. Now, interestingly, in this parable that we're talking about this morning, all three of the people in the parable, the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan, they were all aware of the man alongside of the road in need. Now, it's not always quite that easy for us to see the needs of people around us, though, is it? You know, if we really want to see the needs of people around us, if we really want to become the kind of people who serve others selflessly, then we're going to have to develop a consciousness or an awareness of the needs of others. Right? We have to start first by being aware of what's going on in the lives of our neighbors, our coworkers, our classmates, our teammates, our brothers and sisters at our church. If we know what's going on in their lives, then we're going to have a better chance of knowing when they are hurting, when they are in need in some way. I was thinking about an experience that I had not too long ago, right before this past Thanksgiving. My wife and I were at our house, and the ambulance pulled up with lights and sirens on right to our neighbor's house next door. And as soon as the paramedics left with our neighbor's wife on the stretcher, and they closed the ambulance doors and started pulling off, I immediately walked over and knocked on my neighbor's door, and I thought maybe I could help in some way. I thought, I had offered to drive him to the hospital if he needed that, or I could certainly offer to pray with him, and maybe I could help, if he needed me to make a few phone calls for him or just lock up his house so that he could go. And my neighbor thanked me for my generosity. He said, "Oh, thank you so much for coming over." But actually, my wife had a pretty major heart surgery last week and was in the hospital for 4 days. She had been back home and was getting lightheaded and short of breath, and so we just called the ambulance out of precaution. I felt horrible because I had no idea that his wife had been in the hospital the week before in the first place. I can so easily get wrapped up in my life and in my schedule that I don't really know what's happening in the lives of my neighbor directly next door to me. See, in order for us to serve selflessly, we have to be conscious of what's happening in their lives. And the second principle is that we need to have compassion. We need to have compassion. The passage from today says in Luke chapter 10, verse 33, "But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him," the King James Version says, "he had compassion on him." So unlike the priest and the Levite, the Samaritan had compassion on the injured man. Now, Jews and Samaritans despised each other. But this Samaritan was willing to look beyond all of that and to merely see another human being who had a great need. And he had compassion. See, compassion is about seeing someone else with a need and then allowing your heart to soften, not because the other person deserves it, but because God has put in us empathy and a sensitivity and a concern for others. And so this Samaritan was first conscious. He was aware of what was going on. He was aware of the needs of the man. He then had compassion on him. But if he had stopped there, it wouldn't have been enough. He couldn't just be aware, I see a man in need, and I feel compassion for him. The next principle is that he also had to have contact. He had to have contact. And so Luke chapter 10, verse 34 says, he went to him. See, now, if we're honest, here's where the process breaks down for a lot of us. We see a need, and we even have compassion for the other person. but we're afraid to make contact because sometimes that's not very comfortable. Now, if the Samaritan was going to help this man along the side of the road, he had to get involved. He had to make contact. That meant that he was going to get dirty. It meant that he was likely going to expose himself to being robbed also. And it meant that he would have to associate with someone who he despised and who despised him. Think about the approach that Jesus took when healing various people throughout the Scriptures. So many of the accounts of him healing others include his touch. Jesus certainly had the power to heal without touch, but instead, he makes the choice to reach out and to touch people when he healed. He did it to the man with leprosy. He did it to Peter's mother-in-law who had a fever. He touched the coffin of a young man who was dead. He touched the servant of a high priest. See, the list of people that Jesus touched reads like a who's who of people you should avoid touching at all costs. Many of them were ill with some sort of contagious disease. Most of those Jesus touched were outcasts of society. One was a servant of a man who was going to later call for Christ's execution. But Jesus was willing to take the risk of making contact with all of these people so that he could meet their needs. I was thinking this week about how Jesus might change this parable if he were telling the story to us today. Who would the person on the side of the road that needed to be helped by a neighbor really be? What would they look like if he was telling this to us today? Would it be a homeless person? Would it be an addict? Would it be somebody with whom we disagree with their moral decisions and choices in life? Would it be somebody from a radically different political position than ours? Would we be willing to make contact, to get involved into their lives in order to serve their needs? See, like I said, this is where, for most of us, we drop out of the process. We see the need, we feel compassion, but we bypass this step. But for us to serve selflessly, we have to be willing to make contact. There's no substitute for human touch and involvement in the lives of others. You know, I've shared before that Katie and I, we adopted our son Evan through the foster care system in California, and we actually had a little baby before we had Evan. So we got a foster child, and his name was Eli. And Eli came to us at 4 weeks old. And even at 4 weeks, by the time that Eli came into our home as a foster child, he was labeled by the doctors as failure to thrive. It's a definition that they put. It's not a good thing when a doctor says this little 4-week-old is now in the category of failure to thrive. Eli had been losing weight since birth. We learned shortly thereafter that we got him that he had an esophageal reflux. And when I say he had an esophageal reflux, man, he was born a bit premature, and things were not quite formed right with his digestive system. And any time you laid him down, stomach or on his back, he would spit up anything and everything that was in his stomach. And so we had to keep him upright all the time. And so the home that had Eli for 4 weeks before he came to us, they knew that he would spit up if he was laid down, and so they would feed him while he was sitting in a car seat. And then they would leave him in a car seat, thinking that that would be the most upright position, and therefore he wouldn't spit up. Well, Eli, because of this, received very little human contact, spending most of the first 4 weeks of his life strapped into a car seat. Eli had already, at 4 weeks old, given up crying or making noise of any sort because it had not done him any good. This is another part of the failure to thrive diagnosis. And if you know anything about infants, touch is extremely important. It helps to reduce the stress that they feel, and researchers believe that it helps with the brain's development. Infants need to be touched and held. So when Eli came into our home, we rarely put him down. We held Eli upright during his feedings, after his feedings. We held him upright while he slept. That's another story in and of itself. He never laid down when he was in our home. We held him upright so that he wouldn't spit things up. We even changed his diapers while he was upright. One of us would hold him under the arms with his little skinny legs dangling down, and the other one would take his diaper off, clean him up, and put another diaper on, because if we'd laid him down even to change his diaper, he would spit everything up that was in his stomach. Now, not only did he gain weight quickly when he was in our house, but he began to learn how to cry, and he learned how to vocalize and that he needed something. He started to understand that he could be soothed and comforted by touch. See, contact is a pivotal part of serving others. But being conscious of the needs and feeling compassion and then even making contact, it's still not enough for us to say that we serve selflessly. The fourth principle we can learn from this is that we still need to care. We need to care. See, the Samaritan, according to Luke chapter 10, verse 34, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. Now, if I'm going to care for the needs of others, the first thing that I have to do is determine what the real needs of the other person are. And sometimes, in this case with the story of the Good Samaritan, the needs are pretty obvious. Right? If someone is hurt or hungry or needs clothes, we can pretty easily determine those needs. But sometimes when the needs are more emotional or spiritual, they're not quite as easy for us to see. See, that's where we have to go back to the first principle of being conscious, that first step, right? We have to work at being conscious and being aware of the needs of others. And then once we determine what the needs of others are, then we need to use our resources, whatever we have at our disposal, to meet those needs. Because all the good intentions in the world are no substitute for taking an active role in meeting the needs of others. I really love how plainly James teaches us about this in Scripture. James, in James chapter 2, verses 14 through 17, he says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. And if one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm, and be well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead." So when God brings us into the lives of others, and He gives us the resources to actually meet the needs and to show care, to serve them, and then we fail to care for those people, what James says, what James is arguing very clearly in here, is that our faith is dead. And so when I'm conscious of the needs of others, and even when I have compassion, and when I'm willing to make contact and care for their needs, the fifth principle is still here, and that's that I'm always going to incur a cost. We'll always incur a cost. Luke chapter 10, verse 35 tells us, "The next day he took out 2 silver coins and he gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.'" See, when the Samaritan stopped to help the stranger, it cost him his time. It cost him a great deal of effort. And it cost him some of his resources. When we choose to serve the needs of other people, there's always a cost involved. Sometimes it costs our time. Sometimes it's going to cost our emotional energy. And sometimes it's going to cost our financial resources. Oftentimes it's going to cost us all three of those. Now, I know this is a lot of information for us to take in. It's a pretty high standard that Scripture sets for us about what it means to be a Christian who is called to serve selflessly. And so you may be saying, well, okay, Steve, I get it. I see it from the big picture. I'm not really disagreeing with anything that Scripture teaches, but where do I begin? to develop an attitude of serving selflessly. Well, today is Covenant and Stewardship Sunday. Last week, we spent the week talking about how you would have an opportunity today to bring your financial commitments, right? Your stewardship response cards that you all have. You would have a chance today to bring your financial commitments up to the church, to offer your tithe back to God. Because we're a church that gives generously. And finances are one of the ways and one of the resources that we give. Now, another act of generosity is how we can serve selflessly. And so if you don't know how to put these 5 principles that we've talked about into practice, then I want to encourage you to start right here. Start right here. And when I mean right here, what I mean is start right here at Palos Community Church. So you should have received in the mail a personal covenant form along with the stewardship response card. And so you can take that personal covenant where you were asked to then prayerfully decide and discern how it is that you could start serving God here through the ministries of Palos Community Church. Now, the opportunities to serve Him here are practically endless. We gave you a few ideas on that covenant form, but that's not an exhaustive list. And so if you feel called to serve, if you know that you want to serve, but you're not quite sure exactly how, and none of those categories seem to be the exact right fit, then just make a note. There's a place where you can make a note on that and just say, I want to serve, not quite sure where. And somebody from this church, one of our ministry leaders, will get in touch with you. And we'll get to know you. We'll talk about your gifts and your talents, the ways you feel God calling you to serve. We'll answer any questions that you may have about the different ways that you could serve here at the church, and we'll help you to find a place to serve selflessly through the ministries of Palos Community Church. You know, in just a few moments, we're all going to have an opportunity to come forward and to place our stewardship response cards and our personal covenants into this basket that's sitting here right in front of me. Now, at this time, I want to tell you to keep your offering. We're going to still have our normal weekly time that we give of our tithes and our offerings. But in a few moments, we'll bring up our personal covenants and our stewardship response cards. And I want you to spend these next few moments prayerfully focusing on how it is that you feel God is calling you to give generously and to serve selflessly. Now, let me make something clear. If you're not sure yet, if you feel like God is still moving and talking and you're not exactly sure how you want to commit, whether this is your personal covenant about how you're going to serve, or if it's the stewardship response card, which represents our financial commitments, then feel free to wait. You can bring them with you next week if you need more time to pray about it, and you can drop them in the offering plates next week as they come by. Because we aren't to give and we aren't to serve out of any compulsion, out of anybody manipulating us, out of any kind of obligation that somebody has placed upon us. We give and we serve because of how God has called us to give and serve. And so I'm going to ask Linda. Linda's going to play some music for us on the organ, and I'm going to pray in just a moment, and we're going to then have an opportunity to come forward and bring these commitments to God today. Would you pray with me?